You're listening to P&P Pals, Tabletop Role-playing Radio Theatre. This is the second part of The Battle Begins, a series that considers army-scale battles in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. As before, you might want to review the UA when armies clash. A link should be in the description. Units have a mechanical oddness to them. I described a few of their functions before, but I focused on the distinction between skirmishers and regiments and didn't explain how a unit is formed. You just bundle stands together in any number. Any number. All stands in a unit have to act together, are encouraged to stay near one another to avoid isolation, share a commander, and suffer the same morale effects. Taking all of that into account makes the any number of stands rule a little baffling. To explain briefly, stands are considered isolated if they move too far away from other stands in their unit and receive harsh penalties. When a unit loses more than half the stands it began a battle with, the unit must make continual morale checks to avoid a panic that drives them from the field. Let's consider a battery of 100 dwarves divided into 10 stands. The most simple method of unit arrangement in this case would be a single unit comprised of 10 stands. The benefits of such a formation include a large number of allied units over a large area to ward off isolation, a very high threshold of 6 lost stands before morale becomes an issue, and the ability to command a large number of stands with a single attached commander. The drawbacks are an inflexible application of actions, an obvious problem if 9/10 of the unit are cut off from a target by a bottleneck, a singular unit designation of either skirmisher or regiment, and a large number that can suddenly be broken if morale ever becomes an issue. Think now about the extreme opposite arrangement, 10 stands grouped into 5 pairs. The benefits are a large number of highly flexible, autonomous groups, the ability to create a variety of skirmisher to regiment ratios, and further distinguish regiments with multiple configurations, and, most interestingly, effective immunity to morale breakage. Morale, to the best of my understanding, only becomes a concern when more than half a unit has been defeated, and to get to more than half of 2, everyone has to lose. The drawbacks include a high demand for a number of commanders, and the fact that each of your stands is one ally defeat away from being isolated for the rest of the battle. All of this feels cool. I think it's cool. It's kind of uneven, but I like the trades on offer. In particular, I like the narrative that comes from a large number of small units. I imagine a bunch of guerrilla fighters, unwilling to surrender even after being isolated. I imagine that there's a sweet spot for unit size that's related to the number of solos available to act as commanders. There's also probably a practical limit to the size of a unit, regiments in particular. For example, unless commanders are in short supply, I think I'd prefer 2 units of 3 that try to stick close together over 1 unit of 6 that has to stay together. Speaking of commanders, it's interesting to me that they're largely skill-driven, with an emphasis on charisma and wisdom. Charisma intimidation or charisma persuasion checks by a commander can provide temporary bonuses to all the stands in a unit they control, while wisdom saving throws can prevent a unit from breaking, or help a broken unit recover. This has some cool implications in the rules as written, because it pushes some classes towards leadership roles naturally. Bards and paladins especially seem well suited for commandership. That feels doubly true of a paladin with an aura effect. Since writing the last segment, I've realized something. Solos are not nearly as vulnerable as I imagined. At some point I got it in my head that solos very easily suffered from being isolated, but that's far from the case. Solos actually benefit from nearby allied stands regardless of their declared unit, meaning they can wander the periphery of your units in relative safety. The rules around solos generally require a heroic fantasy mindset. Technically speaking, the only criteria for non-gargantuan solos is significance, but with the solo designation, you're essentially declaring that creature can hold their own in a 10-on-1 battle. There's a small oddity that I've noticed. The attack, dash, and hide actions seem to have been copied directly from party-scale punch-ups. This contrasts with the new retreat action, which takes the place of disengage. This is because the disengage action prevents opportunity attacks from targeting a disengaging creature. Army-scale combat has no opportunity attacks. Instead, stands on opposing sides of a conflict are simply locked to one another unless an order to retreat is issued. It's an odd exclusion, and I'm not sure if it's necessary. In essence, it's just a denial of a risk versus reward mechanism. The omission of opportunity attacks has a few specific knock-on effects as well, typically related to feats and class features, the rogue's cunning action and the sentinel feat specifically. I suppose the intended effect is that of more strict zone control. If that's the case, then I think retreat should instead read, any stand in a unit that takes this action can move even if it begins its turn adjacent to an enemy stand, or after it first becomes adjacent to an enemy stand during movement on this turn. This contrasts with how I interpret the default movement, where it's possible to move parallel and directly adjacent to a row of enemies unimpeded with a single retreat action. With movement in mind, I'd like to very briefly talk about terrain. As a fan of older Fire Emblem and Advance Wars titles, I think a town or city terrain feature that provides a small amount of temporary health at the start of each round is something that I want to make a case for, probably with a caveat that no hostile targets can be adjacent. The trick is that I'll present it alongside an obviously stupid proposal for a throne that makes you way too good at everything. The small city buff will seem so modest in comparison that there's no way it won't make it in. Now, on to what I had to omit entirely from the last segment: damage, casualties, and victory points. In these army-scale battles, action is thought to occur simultaneously. Thanks to this, creatures don't fall unconscious, begin dying, or are otherwise removed from play immediately when reduced to 0 hit points. That instead happens during a cleanup phase at the end of each round. This is a potentially brutal inclusion, where it's harder to act without cost, and large numbers of weaker creatures can slowly grind down stronger ones. Broadly speaking, I imagine it will have a smaller impact on more straightforward, reliable creatures and classes, hurting those that rely on powerful alpha strikes much more. Imagine a high initiative stand of wizards blowing up a whole unit of fighters, just to have those down but not out warriors march over and mulch them before the round ends. There's a neat synergy here concerning features that act as a health gate or a second chance mechanic. The half-orc's relentless endurance comes to mind. With that feature, a stand of half-orcs should be guaranteed at least 2 rounds in the field. That's a pretty big deal, as it positions their race as uniquely suited to this scale of battle. One thing of great interest to me, since I'm the player and won't have an infinite number of creatures to field, is that the rules only mention casualties, not fatalities. I wonder how often creatures actually survive those death saves. Wait, what? Oh, of course someone did that math. No, I don't need to see the graph. I believe you. Thanks, Googs. Google has just informed me that a creature survives death saving throws about 60% of the time if no one intervenes. I suppose the numbers at this scale are large enough to use the percentage without any rolling. This area feels like fertile ground for a number of passive army improvements. Maybe medical kits could be distributed to each stand to increase the survival rate by some value, or the presence of clerics or other healers in a unit might do the same. It's already been established in the show that well-organized armies don't suffer large numbers of fatalities, so I'd like to find a way to express that mechanically for any force that qualifies as a well-organized army. In many ways, these rules suggest a second measure of vitality, and that's the stand count of any given unit. If more than half a unit is defeated, those left will need to make morale checks to keep their cool. On a failed check, the stands will try to leave the field. I think this design is meant to push battles towards a conclusion by removing creatures early. I think it complements the victory point system quite nicely in that regard. Victory points have 2 important goals. They establish objectives beyond kill all the mans, and they create a method by which a battle can end without one side having run out of mans to kill. These are ideas that I use when I DM standard D&D, so I love seeing them canonized here. Because it's a point-based system, different grades of victory and loss are also possible. Hey, reading the rules again, there is a section related to long-term losses. I hate it. It's dumb. If a battle is lost by a wide enough margin, there's a fair chance that each of the intact units will just up and leave. Not intact stands, intact units. This feels like a deck of many things, in that you're basically leaving the abrupt end of the campaign up to random chance. I have a little time left, so I'm going to use it on an ounce of speculative design. There's a game I like called Ogre Battle, Person of Lordly Caliber. In that title, you arrange 3 to 5 characters on a 3x3 grid. Functionally, they act as a single character, directed much as you'd order a lone soldier in a different strategy game. In battle, you don't control them directly. They work as a team, taking actions determined by their placement on the grid. As an example, a Valkyrie can attack twice with a spear in the front row, or fire 2 bolts of lightning from the back. It's possible to tweak the overall tone of a unit by adding 1 or 2 specific characters. A single cleric or witch can mitigate damage to improve the survivability of a group, while the inclusion of a golem or dragon can focus incoming damage to a single hardy target. I feel like there's room, both physically and conceptually, for something similar in these rules. Groups of specialists that don't have the numbers of stands or the individual power of solos. Imagine an attaché of 3 to 5 low-level clerics, whose only job is to heal and stabilize the dying. I could see squires bearing flags and equipment into battle for their knights, or hunting dogs that provide a stand advantage on wisdom perception checks. You know, now that I'm writing it down and saying it out loud, this sounds more like a form of stand-scale equipment. That's all for today. This was the first segment that got a sequel, and it feels like the kind of thing that we'll still be able to come back to in the future, once we have more experience with these rules. If you have any questions, find our social media below, or leave a comment. The music for our intro was composed by Walker Williams. We have links to him and his work in the description. This show is produced by Precarious at best, and heard by you. See you around, Curious Traveler.